Welcome to WebLizard Cert Lab. This is an AZ-900 practice exam with 50 exam-style questions. Work through each scenario, choose your answer before the reveal, then use the explanation to strengthen your Azure fundamentals. We will cover cloud concepts, Azure services, pricing, security, and governance. Think first, then learn why the answer works. Here is how the practice exam works. Read the full scenario and identify the exact requirement. When the visual countdown appears, commit to your answer before the reveal. Then we lock the correct choice, explain why it wins, and call out the distractors so missed answers become study targets. The countdown stays visual only, so the narration can focus on the question and explanation. Question 1. A company is deploying a business-critical application on Azure virtual machines. The application must remain available if a single data center within an Azure region experiences an outage, but the company does not require protection from a complete regional outage. Which Azure feature should the company use? A. Availability zones. B. Availability sets. C. Region pairs. D. Proximity placement groups. The correct answer is A. Availability zones. Availability zones are separate physical locations within an Azure region. They help keep virtual machines available if one data center, or zone, has an outage. Availability sets are plausible, but they protect across fault and update domains, not across separate availability zones. Region pairs are for broader regional disaster recovery. Proximity placement groups reduce latency by keeping resources close together. Exam trap. Match the scope. Single data center failure inside one region points to availability zones, not region pairs. Question 2. A startup wants to avoid purchasing physical servers before it knows whether its new application will succeed. The company wants to pay only for the compute resources it uses each month. A. High availability. B. Consumption-based pricing. C. Fault tolerance. D. Elasticity. The correct answer is B. Consumption-based pricing. Consumption-based pricing means you pay for the resources you actually use, typically as an operating expense, instead of buying physical servers up front. High availability is about minimizing downtime. Fault tolerance is about continuing after a component fails. Elasticity is about scaling resources with demand, which can help control costs, but it is not the billing model itself. Exam trap. When the scenario says pay only for what you use each month, think consumption-based pricing. Question 3. A company uses Microsoft Entra ID to manage employee access to Azure resources. The security team wants users to provide an additional verification method when signing in from an unfamiliar location. A. Conditional access. B. Azure Policy. C. Role-based access control. D. Management groups. The correct answer is A. Conditional access. Conditional access can require multi-factor authentication based on sign-in context, such as the user's location, device, or risk level. Azure Policy is a strong distractor because it is used for governance, but it governs Azure resource configuration, not user sign-in verification. Role-based access control controls permissions after authentication. Management groups organize subscriptions. Exam trap. When a question talks about sign-in conditions and extra verification, think conditional access. Question 4. A company wants to ensure that all newly created Azure resources include a department tag. Users should still be allowed to create resources if they have the correct permissions, but resources that do not meet the tagging requirement should be denied or flagged as non-compliant. A. Microsoft Entra ID. B. Azure Policy. C. Azure Role-Based Access Control. D. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. The correct answer is B. Azure Policy. Azure Policy is used to enforce or audit organizational standards for Azure resources, including required tags, allowed locations, or allowed resource types. In this scenario, the clue is that resources must be denied or marked non-compliant when they do not meet a tagging requirement. Microsoft Entra ID manages identities and sign-ins. Role-based access control grants permissions to perform actions, but it does not inspect whether the resource has the right tag. Microsoft Defender for Cloud can recommend security improvements, but Azure Policy is the governance tool that enforces the tag rule. Exam trap: RBAC answers who is allowed to create the resource. Azure Policy answers whether the created resource complies with organizational rules. Question 5. A company stores business documents in Azure storage. The documents must remain available if a single data center in the primary Azure region fails. The company does not require automatic replication to another Azure region. A. Locally redundant storage. B. Zone redundant storage. C. Geo-redundant storage. D. Read-access geo-redundant storage. The correct answer is B. Zone redundant storage. Zone redundant storage replicates data across availability zones in the same primary Azure region. That is the key match for this scenario. The company needs protection if a single data center, or zone, in the primary region fails, but it does not need replication to a paired region. Locally redundant storage keeps copies within one data center, so it does not satisfy the data center failure requirement. Geo-redundant storage and read-access geo-redundant storage both replicate to a secondary region, which is more than the company asked for. Exam trap: when the requirement says primary region plus data center or zone failure, think ZRS. When the requirement says regional outage or secondary region, then look at GRS or RAGRS. Question 6. A company runs a web application on Azure App Service. The company wants to understand which security tasks it is still responsible for when using this platform as a service offering. A. Replacing failed physical network switches in the Azure data center. B. Applying security updates to the underlying host operating system. C. Configuring authentication and authorization for the web application. D. Maintaining the physical security of the data center facility. The correct answer is C. Configuring authentication and authorization for the web application. Azure App Service is a platform as a service offering. Microsoft manages the physical data center, the network hardware, and the underlying platform, including host operating system maintenance. But the customer still owns the application and its configuration. That includes deciding how users sign in, which users or groups are authorized, and how the app protects its own data and business logic. The trap is the shared responsibility shift. Moving from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service removes more operating system and infrastructure work from the customer, but it does not remove responsibility for application-level security decisions. Question 7. A company wants to run a small piece of code in Azure whenever a message is added to a storage queue. The company does not want to manage servers, and the code should run only when the event occurs. A. Azure Functions. B. Azure Virtual Machines. C. Azure Kubernetes Service. D. Azure App Service. The correct answer is A. Azure Functions. Azure Functions is the serverless compute service designed to run small pieces of code in response to events, such as a message arriving in a queue. The company does not manage servers, and it can pay based on execution. Azure Virtual Machines would require managing the operating system and server. Azure Kubernetes Service is for orchestrating containers. Azure App Service is a strong platform for web apps and APIs, but the event-triggered code pattern points directly to Azure Functions. The exam clue is small code, event occurs, no server management. Question 8. A company wants to reduce unnecessary Azure spending. The finance team needs to identify underused resources and receive recommendations for cost optimization. Select two correct answers. A. Microsoft Cost Management. B. Azure Advisor. C. Azure Monitor. D. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. E. Azure Resource Manager Templates. The correct answers are A and B. Microsoft Cost Management and Azure Advisor. Microsoft Cost Management helps the finance team analyze Azure spending, budgets, and cost trends. Azure Advisor reviews deployed resources and gives recommendations, including ways to reduce cost by right-sizing or shutting down underused resources. Azure Monitor is useful for metrics and logs, but it is not the primary cost optimization recommendation service. Microsoft Defender for Cloud focuses on security posture. Azure Resource Manager templates deploy resources. They do not analyze spending. The exam clue is spending analysis plus optimization recommendations. Question 9. A company has two Azure virtual networks in the same region. Resources in each virtual network need to communicate with each other privately by using Microsoft's backbone network. The company does not want the traffic to go over the public internet. A. Virtual network peering. B. Azure VPN gateway. C. Azure Express Route. D. Azure Load Balancer. The correct answer is A. Virtual network peering. Virtual network peering lets Azure virtual networks communicate privately through Microsoft's backbone network. For two Azure virtual networks in the same region, this is the direct service the question is describing. Azure VPN Gateway is more often used for encrypted tunnel connections, such as connecting Azure to on-premises networks. ExpressRoute privately connects on-premises environments to Azure. Azure Load Balancer distributes traffic to resources. It does not connect virtual networks. The exam clue is that two Azure virtual networks, private communication, Microsoft backbone. Question 10. A company has several Azure subscriptions for different departments. The IT governance team wants to apply the same access assignments and policy controls across multiple subscriptions without configuring each subscription individually. A. Resource groups. B. Management groups. C. Azure reservations. D. Azure blueprints. The correct answer is B. Management groups. Management groups organize multiple Azure subscriptions into a hierarchy. That lets a governance team apply access control and policy assignments centrally across subscriptions instead of configuring each one individually. Resource groups organize resources inside a single subscription, so they do not solve governance across many subscriptions. Azure reservations reduce compute costs for committed usage. Azure blueprints can package governance artifacts, but the structure for applying governance across multiple subscriptions is management groups. The exam clue is multiple subscriptions, same access and policy controls, central governance. Question 11. Select two correct answers. A company is evaluating whether to use a hybrid cloud model. The company wants to keep some workloads in its on-premises data center while moving other workloads to Azure. A. It combines on-premises infrastructure with public cloud resources. B. It requires all applications to run only in a private data center. C. It can allow workloads to move between an on-premises environment and a public cloud. D. It prevents organizations from using consumption-based pricing. E. It removes the customer's responsibility for managing all operating systems. The correct answers are A and C. A hybrid cloud combines on-premises infrastructure with public cloud resources. It can also support moving or coordinating workloads between an on-premises environment and a public cloud such as Azure. B is too restrictive because hybrid does not mean everything stays private. D is wrong because Azure workloads can still use consumption-based pricing. E is wrong because responsibility depends on the service model, and on-premises operating systems remain customer-managed. The exam clue is keep some workloads on-premises while moving others to Azure. Question 12. A company wants to migrate an existing SQL Server database to Azure. The company wants to keep SQL Server compatibility, but avoid managing the underlying virtual machine operating system. A. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. B. Azure SQL Database. C. Azure Cosmos DB. D. Azure Table Storage. The correct answer is B. Azure SQL Database. Azure SQL Database is a managed relational database service that keeps SQL Server compatibility while removing the need to manage the underlying virtual machine operating system. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines can provide strong SQL Server compatibility, but the company would still manage the VM and operating system. Azure Cosmos DB is a NoSQL database service. Azure Table Storage is also a NoSQL key value style storage service. The exam clue is SQL Server compatibility, but no virtual machine operating system management. Question 13. An operations team wants to collect metrics and logs from Azure resources, create alerts when performance thresholds are crossed, and visualize resource health over time. A. Azure Monitor. B. Microsoft Cost Management. C. Azure Policy. D. Microsoft Entra ID. The correct answer is A. Azure Monitor. Azure Monitor is the main Azure service for collecting metrics and logs, creating alerts, and visualizing operational health across Azure resources. Microsoft Cost Management focuses on spending and budgets, not operational telemetry. Azure Policy evaluates whether resources comply with rules and standards. Microsoft Entra ID handles identity and access, not performance monitoring. The exam clue is metrics, logs, alerts, and resource health over time. Question 14. A company wants to run a containerized application in Azure. The application needs orchestration features such as scaling, self-healing, and rolling updates across multiple container instances. The company is comfortable using Kubernetes. A. Azure Container Instances. B. Azure Kubernetes Service. C. Azure App Service. D. Azure Functions. The correct answer is B. Azure Kubernetes Service. Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, provides managed Kubernetes orchestration for containerized applications. It supports scaling, self-healing, rolling updates, and coordination across multiple container instances. Azure Container Instances is simpler and useful for running individual containers without full Kubernetes orchestration. Azure App Service can host web apps and containers, but it is not the Kubernetes orchestration platform. Azure Functions is event-driven serverless compute. The exam clue is Kubernetes plus orchestration features such as scaling, self-healing, and rolling updates. Question 15. A company stores monthly financial reports in Azure Blob storage. The reports are rarely accessed after the first 30 days, but they must remain available for occasional review. The company wants to reduce storage costs while still being able to retrieve the reports when needed. A. Hot. B. Cool. C. Premium. D. Locally redundant. The correct answer is B. Cool. The Cool access tier is designed for infrequently accessed blob storage data that still needs to remain available for retrieval. It lowers storage cost compared with Hot when data is not accessed often. Hot is best for frequently accessed data. Premium is for low latency, frequently accessed workloads. Locally redundant storage is a redundancy choice, not a blob storage access tier. The exam clue is rarely accessed. lower storage cost, but still retrievable when needed. Question 16. An administrator wants to know whether an Azure service outage in a specific region is affecting the company's resources. The administrator also wants official Microsoft updates about the outage and estimated resolution progress. A. Azure Service Health. B. Azure Resource Health. C. Azure Monitor Metrics. D. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. The correct answer is A. Azure Service Health. Azure Service Health gives personalized official incident and maintenance updates. Azure Resource Health diagnoses individual resource health, not service incident communications. Azure Monitor Metrics show resource telemetry but not official incident updates. Microsoft Defender for Cloud focuses on security posture. The exam clue is get official Microsoft incident updates for service outages affecting your Azure resources. Question 17. A company hosts a public web application in Azure across multiple regions. The company wants user requests to be routed to the closest available regional endpoint based on network latency. If one region becomes unavailable, traffic should be sent to another available region. A. Azure Load Balancer. B. Azure Application Gateway. C. Azure Traffic Manager. D. Azure Bastion. The correct answer is C. Azure Traffic Manager. Traffic Manager routes users to healthy endpoints using DNS-based methods such as performance routing. Azure Load Balancer distributes TCP/UDP traffic typically within a region. Azure Application Gateway is regional layer 7 load balancing (WAF), not DNS-based global latency routing. Azure Bastion provides secure VM RDP SSH access. The exam clue is route public users to the closest healthy regional endpoint using DNS-based performance routing. Question 18. A company has several Azure virtual machines that need to be accessed by administrators using RDP and SSH. The company does not want to expose RDP or SSH ports directly to the public internet. A. Azure Bastion. B. Azure VPN Gateway. C. Azure Firewall. D. Network Security Groups. The correct answer is A. Azure Bastion. Azure Bastion enables secure administrative VM access without public RDP SSH exposure. Azure VPN Gateway can provide private connectivity, but Bastion is purpose-built for this access scenario. Azure Firewall filters traffic. It does not provide managed RDP SSH access. Network Security Groups. NSGs filter traffic but do not provide the managed access service. The exam clue is administer VMs with RDP or SSH without exposing those ports to the public internet. Question 19. A company is designing its Azure Resource Organization strategy. The team wants to understand how resource groups work before deploying production workloads. A. A resource group can belong to multiple Azure subscriptions at the same time. B. Deleting a resource group deletes only the metadata for the group, not the resources inside it. C. A resource can belong to only one resource group at a time. D. Resource groups are used to provide physical isolation between Azure data centers. E. Resource groups can contain resources from multiple Azure regions. The correct answers are C and E. A resource can belong to only one resource group at a time, and resource groups can contain resources from multiple Azure regions. A resource belongs to one resource group, and a resource group can contain resources from multiple Azure regions. A resource group can belong to multiple Azure subscriptions at the same time. A resource group exists in one subscription. Deleting a resource group deletes only the metadata for the group, not the resources inside it. Deleting a resource group deletes contained resources. Resource groups are used to provide physical isolation between Azure data centers. Resource groups are logical containers, not physical isolation boundaries. The exam clue is a resource has one resource group, but a resource group can contain resources from multiple regions. Question 20. A company has a production Azure storage account that must not be accidentally deleted by administrators. Administrators still need to read and update data in the storage account when necessary. A. Azure Policy with an audit effect. B. A read-only resource lock. C. A delete resource lock. D. Azure role-based access control at the subscription scope. The correct answer is C. A delete resource lock. A delete lock prevents accidental resource deletion while still allowing allowed updates. Azure Policy with an audit effect. Audit reports non-compliance, but does not directly block deletion. A read-only resource lock. Read-only would block updates too, which is too restrictive. Azure role-based access control at the subscription scope. RBAC controls permissions, but a delete lock adds protection even for broad permissions. The exam clue is prevent accidental deletion while still allowing permitted read and update operations. Question 21. A developer is building an application that runs on an Azure virtual machine. The application needs to access Azure Key Vault to retrieve secrets. The company wants to avoid storing client secrets, certificates, or passwords in the application code or configuration files. A. A shared access signature. B. A managed identity. C. A network security group. D. A resource lock. The correct answer is B, a managed identity. Managed identities remove the need to store credentials in code or config for Azure Service Access. A shared access signature, SAS, is mainly scoped access to Azure storage, not VM to key vault identity. A network security group, NSGs control traffic, not application identity. A resource lock. Locks prevent deletion/modification, not authentication. The exam clue is, let an Azure-hosted application access Key Vault without storing credentials in code or configuration. Question 22. A company is designing network security for Azure virtual machines. The security team wants to control inbound and outbound traffic at the subnet or network interface level. They also want to create rules based on source and destination IP addresses, ports, and protocols. A. Azure DDoS protection. B. Network security groups. C. Azure Application Gateway. D. Security rules. E. Azure Traffic Manager. The correct answers are B and D, network security groups and security rules. Network security groups and their security rules control subnet/NIC traffic. Azure DDoS protection. DDoS protection mitigates DDoS attacks, not normal subnet/NIC allow-deny rules. Azure Application Gateway. Application Gateway is Layer 7 load balancing, WAF, not subnet/NIC filtering. Azure Traffic Manager. Traffic Manager is DNS-based global routing, not traffic filtering. The exam clue is control subnet or network interface traffic with rules for IP addresses, ports, and protocols. Question 23. An online retailer expects a large increase in website traffic during a weekend sale. The company wants its Azure-hosted application to automatically add resources during the sale and remove them afterward when demand decreases. A. Fault tolerance. B. High availability. C. Elasticity. D. Disaster recovery. The correct answer is C. Elasticity. Elasticity describes automatically scaling resources up and down with demand. Fault tolerance. Fault tolerance concerns component failure. High availability. High availability keeps services accessible, not specifically scale up/down with demand. Disaster recovery. Disaster recovery restores service after major failure. The exam clue is automatically add resources during demand spikes and remove them when demand falls. Question 24. A company wants to improve the security posture of its Azure environment. The security team needs recommendations for misconfigured resources, secure score tracking, and guidance for reducing security risks across subscriptions. A. Azure Policy. B. Azure Monitor. C. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. D. Microsoft Entra ID Governance. The correct answer is C. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Microsoft Defender for Cloud provides security posture recommendations and secure score. Azure Policy. Policy can enforce/audit configuration, but the scenario asks for secure score and security posture recommendations. Azure Monitor. Monitor collects telemetry, not secure score posture management. Microsoft Entra ID Governance. Entra ID Governance manages identity lifecycle/access governance, not Azure Resource Secure Score. The exam clue is improve cloud security posture with recommendations, secure score, and risk reduction guidance. Question 25. A company wants to connect its on-premises data center to Azure. The connection must be private, should not traverse the public internet, and should provide more predictable performance than a site-to-site VPN. A. Azure VPN Gateway. B. Virtual Network Peering. C. Azure Express Route. D. Azure Private Link. The correct answer is C. Azure Express Route. Express Route provides private, predictable connectivity between on-premises networks and Azure. Azure VPN. Gateway, site-to-site VPN uses encrypted tunnels over the public internet. Virtual network peering. Peering connects Azure VNets, not an on-premises data center to Azure. Azure Private Link. Private Link provides private access to Azure services, not broad data center connectivity. The exam clue is connect on-premises to Azure privately with predictable performance and no public internet traversal. Question 26. A team uses Azure Resource Manager templates to deploy infrastructure. They want to understand the benefits of using ARM templates instead of manually creating resources in the Azure portal. A. They provide physical isolation between Azure data centers. B. They allow infrastructure deployments to be repeated consistently. C. They automatically reduce compute usage charges for virtual machines. D. They define infrastructure as code for Azure resources. E. They replace the need for role-based access control. The correct answers are B and D. They allow infrastructure deployments to be repeated consistently, and they define infrastructure as code for Azure resources. ARM templates provide repeatable infrastructure as code deployments. They provide physical isolation between Azure data centers. Physical isolation comes from regions/zones, not templates. They automatically reduce compute usage charges for virtual machines. Templates do not automatically reduce charges. They replace the need for role-based access control. RBAC is still required to control deployment permissions. The exam clue is define Azure infrastructure as code so deployments can be repeated consistently. Question 27. A company is designing storage for a shared drive that will be accessed by several Windows virtual machines in Azure. The solution should support the SMB protocol and allow the VMs to mount the storage as a network file share. A. Azure Blob Storage. B. Azure Queue Storage. C. Azure Files. D. Azure Disk Storage. The correct answer is C. Azure Files. Azure Files provides managed file shares accessible via SMB. Azure Blob Storage. Blob storage is object storage, not an SMB file share. Azure Queue. Storage. Queue storage is messaging. Azure Disk Storage. Managed disks are block storage for VMs, not shared SMB file shares. The exam clue is provide an SMB network file share that Windows virtual machines can mount. Question 28. A company plans to deploy several predictable, steady-state virtual machine workloads in Azure for the next 3 years. The company wants to reduce compute costs compared with pay-as-you-go pricing. A. Azure Spot Virtual Machines. B. Azure Reservations. C. Azure Policy Exemptions. D. Microsoft Cost Management Budgets. The correct answer is B. Azure Reservations. Azure Reservations reduce cost for predictable, committed resource usage. Azure Spot Virtual Machines. Spot VMs can be evicted and are not ideal for steady-state reliability. Azure Policy Exemptions. Policy exemptions do not discount compute. Microsoft Cost Management Budgets. Budgets alert on spend, but do not directly discount compute. The exam clue is commit to predictable, steady-state compute usage to reduce costs versus pay-as-you-go. Question 29. A manufacturer wants to collect telemetry from thousands of factory sensors and manage communication between the devices and Azure. The solution should support device-to-cloud messages and cloud-to-device communication. A. Azure Event Grid. B. Azure Service Bus. C. Azure IoT Hub. D. Azure Queue Storage. The correct answer is C. Azure IoT Hub. Azure IoT Hub is the Azure service for large-scale IoT device communication. Azure Event Grid. Event Grid routes events but is not IoT device communications/management. Azure Service Bus. Service Bus is enterprise application messaging, not IoT device management. Azure Queue Storage. Queue Storage is simple application messaging and lacks IoT device features. The exam clue is manage large-scale device-to-cloud and cloud-to-device IoT communication. Question 30. A company wants to strengthen identity security for Azure Access. The security team wants to reduce risk from compromised passwords and ensure administrators use stronger sign-in protections. A. Enable multi-factor authentication for administrator accounts. B. Require conditional access policies for risky sign-ins. C. Move all resources into a single resource group. D. Use Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management for eligible admin roles. E. Configure locally redundant storage for identity logs. F. Replace Azure Policy assignments with management locks. The correct answers are A, B, and D. Enable multi-factor authentication for administrator accounts, require conditional access policies for risky sign-ins, and use Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management for eligible admin roles. MFA, conditional access, and PM strengthen identity security for Azure Access. Move all resources into a single resource group. Resource grouping does not strengthen identity security. Configure locally redundant storage for identity logs. Storage redundancy does not strengthen sign-in protections. Replace Azure Policy assignments with management locks. Locks protect resources from modification, deletion, not identity sign-in risk. The exam clue is strengthen administrator identity security with MFA, risk-based access controls, and just-in-time privileged roles. Question 31. A company hosts a public website in Azure. Users are located around the world, and the company wants to improve page load times by caching static content closer to users. A. Azure Application Gateway. B. Azure Content Delivery Network. C. Azure Express Route. D. Azure Load Balancer. The correct answer is B. Azure Content Delivery Network. Azure CDN improves global load time by caching static content near users. Azure Application Gateway. Application Gateway is Regional Layer 7 Load Balancing WAF, not Global Edge Caching. Azure Express Route. Express Route provides private connectivity, not caching. Azure Load Balancer. Load Balancer distributes traffic, not global content caching. The exam clue is cache static website content closer to globally distributed users. Question 32. A company is building an order processing system. When a customer submits an order, the order must be placed into a queue so that a back-end service can process it later. The company needs enterprise messaging features such as sessions, duplicate detection, and dead lettering. A. Azure Event Grid. B. Azure Queue Storage. C. Azure Service Bus. D. Azure Event Hubs. The correct answer is C. Azure Service Bus. Azure Service Bus is the enterprise messaging service for queues and topics with advanced features. Azure Event Grid. Event Grid is event routing, not enterprise queue processing. Azure Queue Storage. Queue storage is simpler and lacks the advanced enterprise features listed. Azure Event Hubs. Event Hubs is high-throughput event streaming, not enterprise command queues. The exam clue is use enterprise queues with sessions, duplicate detection, and dead lettering. Question 33. A company needs to review Microsoft's compliance offerings, audit reports, privacy information, and documentation related to regulatory standards for Azure and other Microsoft cloud services. A. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. B. Microsoft Service Trust Portal. C. Azure Monitor. D. Azure Advisor. The correct answer is B. Microsoft Service Trust Portal. The Microsoft Service Trust Portal is used for Microsoft compliance and audit documentation. Microsoft Defender for Cloud helps security posture and compliance views, but not the audit report portal. Azure Monitor. Monitor handles metrics /logs /alerts. Azure Advisor. Advisor provides recommendations, not compliance audit reports. The exam clue is find Microsoft Cloud compliance documentation, audit reports, and regulatory resources. Question 34. A development team wants to host a web application in Azure without managing virtual machines. The application must support built-in deployment slots so the team can test a new version before swapping it into production. A. Azure Virtual Machines. B. Azure App Service. C. Azure Container Instances. D. Azure Batch. The correct answer is B. Azure App Service. Azure App Service provides managed web app hosting with deployment slots. Azure Virtual Machines. VMs require OS/server management. Azure Container Instance ACI runs containers but does not provide app service deployment slots. Azure Batch. Batch is for large-scale parallel/HPC jobs. The exam clue is host a managed web application with deployment slots and no virtual machine management. Question 35. A company is comparing infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service in Azure. A. In infrastructure as a service, the customer is usually responsible for managing the guest operating system. B. In software as a service, the customer is usually responsible for maintaining the application's underlying servers. C. In platform as a service, Microsoft manages more of the underlying infrastructure than in infrastructure as a service. D. In infrastructure as a service, Microsoft is responsible for configuring the customer's application data access rules. E. In software as a service, the customer is usually responsible for replacing failed physical hardware. The correct answers are A and C. In infrastructure as a service, the customer is usually responsible for managing the guest operating system. And in platform as a service, Microsoft manages more of the underlying infrastructure than in infrastructure as a service. IaaS leaves guest OS management to the customer. PaaS shifts more platform management to Microsoft. In software as a service, the customer is usually responsible for maintaining the application's underlying servers. In SaaS, the provider manages the application platform and servers. In infrastructure as a service, Microsoft is responsible for configuring the customer's application data access rules. Application data access rules are generally customer responsibility. In software as a service, the customer is usually responsible for replacing failed physical hardware. Physical hardware is the cloud provider's responsibility. The exam clue is IaaS leaves more management to the customer, while PaaS and SaaS shift more responsibility to Microsoft. Question 36. A company stores private reports in Azure Blob storage. The reports should not be publicly accessible. An application needs temporary, limited access to read a specific blob without granting access to the entire storage account. A. A storage account access key. B. Azure front door. C. A shared access signature. D. A management lock. The correct answer is C. A shared access signature. A shared access signature can provide temporary, scoped access to a private blob. A storage account access key. Account keys are broad and too powerful for limited one-blob access. Azure front door. Front door routes/accelerates. HTTPS traffic. It does not grant blob permissions. A management lock. Locks prevent deletion modification, not temporary data access. The exam clue is grant temporary scoped access to a private blob without exposing the whole storage account. Question 37. A company wants to move several existing SQL Server databases to Azure with minimal changes. The company needs near-complete compatibility with SQL Server features such as SQL agent jobs and cross-database queries, but does not want to manage the underlying operating system. A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure Database for PostgreSQL. C. Azure SQL Managed Instance. D. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. The correct answer is C. Azure SQL Managed Instance. Azure SQL Managed Instance is designed for SQL Server migrations needing high compatibility without OS management. Azure SQL Database. SQL Database is managed but has less instance-level SQL Server compatibility than Managed Instance. Azure Database for PostgreSQL. PostgreSQL is not SQL Server compatibility. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. VMs provide control/compatibility but require OS management. The exam clue is migrate SQL Server with high compatibility and no operating system management. Question 38. A company wants to be notified when Azure spending for a subscription approaches a monthly spending limit. The company does not need to prevent resource creation automatically, but it does want alerts before costs exceed the expected amount. A. Azure Policy Assignment. B. Resource Lock. C. Azure Advisor Recommendation. D. Microsoft Cost Management Budget. The correct answer is D. Microsoft Cost Management Budget. Cost management budgets send alerts when spend approaches configured thresholds. Azure Policy Assignment. Policy governs resource configuration, not spending threshold alerts. Resource lock. Locks prevent deletion/modification, not spending alerts. Azure Advisor Recommendation. Advisor recommends optimizations but does not define budget alert thresholds. The exam clue is send spending alerts when Azure costs approach a configured monthly threshold. Question 39. A company is planning where to deploy workloads in Azure. The team wants to understand how Azure regions and region pairs support resiliency and compliance planning. A. An Azure region is a set of data centers deployed within a latency-defined perimeter. B. Every Azure region is paired with another region in the same country. C. Region pairs can support disaster recovery planning by providing geographic separation. D. Availability zones are always located in different countries from each other. E. A resource group's location determines the region of every resource inside it. The correct answers are A and C. An Azure region is a set of data centers deployed within a latency-defined perimeter, and region pairs can support disaster recovery planning by providing geographic separation. Azure regions are data center groupings. Region pairs support geographically separated disaster recovery planning. Every Azure region is paired with another region in the same country. Region pairs are generally in the same geography, but not necessarily the same country. Availability zones are always located in different countries from each other. Availability zones are separate data centers within a region. A resource group's location determines the region of every resource inside it. Resources in one resource group can be in different regions. The exam clue is regions are data center groupings, while region pairs help with geographically separated resiliency planning. Question 40. A company owns the domain name contoso.com and wants Azure to host the DNS records for the domain. The company needs to create and manage records such as A, CNMA, and MX records from Azure. A. Azure Traffic Manager. B. Azure Private Link. C. Azure DNS. D. Azure Front Door. The correct answer is C. Azure DNS. Azure DNS hosts DNS zones and lets organizations manage records such as A, CNAME, MX, and TXT records. Azure Traffic Manager. Traffic Manager provides DNS-based traffic routing to endpoints, but it is not the general-purpose service for hosting and managing a domain's DNS zone records. Azure Private Link. Private Link provides private access to Azure services through private endpoints. It does not host public DNS records for a domain. Azure Front Door. Azure Front Door provides global HTTP/S routing, acceleration, and web application firewall capabilities. It can use custom domains, but it is not the service for hosting the domain's DNS zone. The exam clue is host and manage DNS zone records such as A, CNAME, and MX from Azure. Question 41. A company has an application running in an Azure virtual network. The application needs to connect to an Azure storage account without sending traffic over the public internet. The company wants the storage account to be reachable through a private IP address inside the virtual network. A. Azure Express Route. B. A private endpoint. C. Azure Traffic Manager. DS4 or DNM called public endpoint with a shared access signature. The correct answer is B. A private endpoint. A private endpoint uses Azure Private Link to expose a supported Azure service, such as Azure Storage, through a private IP address in a virtual network. Azure ExpressRoute provides private connectivity between on-premises networks and Azure. It does not by itself make an Azure Storage account available through a private IP address inside a virtual network. Azure Traffic Manager. Traffic Manager is DNS-based global traffic routing. It does not provide private IP connectivity to a storage account. A public endpoint with a shared access signature. A shared access signature can grant scoped access to storage, but using the public endpoint does not meet the requirement to avoid public internet routing and use a private IP inside the virtual network. The exam clue is reach an Azure service through a private IP address inside a virtual network. Question 42. A company wants to use Azure Policy to control resource deployments. The governance team has two requirements. 1. Prevent users from creating virtual machines in regions that are not approved. 2. Track existing storage accounts that do not have required tags without blocking changes immediately. A. Append. B. Deny. C. Audit. D. Deploy if not exists. E. Read only. The correct answers are B and C, deny and audit. Deny blocks non-compliant deployments, while audit records non-compliance without blocking changes. Append. Append can add fields to a resource request, such as adding a tag or property. It does not block unapproved regions, and it is not the best match for simply tracking non-compliant existing resources. Deploy if not exists. Deploy if not exists can deploy related resources when a condition is met, such as enabling diagnostic settings. It is not the direct effect for blocking regions or merely tracking tag non-compliance. Read only. Read only is a resource lock level, not an Azure policy effect. The exam clue is use deny to block non-compliant deployments and audit to report non-compliance without blocking. Question 43. A company wants employees to access a Windows desktop experience and business applications from different devices without deploying physical desktop computers for each user. The company wants Microsoft Azure to host the virtualized desktop environment. A. Azure App Service. B. Azure Virtual Desktop. C. Azure Functions. D. Azure Kubernetes Service. The correct answer is B. Azure Virtual Desktop. Azure Virtual Desktop provides cloud-hosted virtual desktops and remote applications that users can access from multiple device types. Azure App Service. App Service hosts web applications and APIs. It does not provide full virtualized Windows desktops for end users. Azure Functions. Azure Functions runs event-driven code without managing servers. It is not a desktop virtualization service. Azure Kubernetes Service. AKS orchestrates containerized applications. It does not provide Windows desktop sessions for employees. The exam clue is provide cloud-hosted Windows desktops and remote apps across user devices. Question 44. A company is designing a cloud solution and wants to distinguish between high availability and disaster recovery. A. Disaster recovery eliminates the need to test backups or failover procedures. B. High availability requires all resources to be deployed in only one data center. C. High availability focuses on keeping a service accessible during normal component failures or maintenance events. D. High availability and disaster recovery both mean that resources must never scale down. ESA. Disaster recovery focuses on restoring service after a major outage or catastrophic failure. The correct answers are C and E. High availability focuses on keeping a service accessible during normal component failures or maintenance events. And disaster recovery focuses on restoring service after a major outage or catastrophic failure. High availability focuses on reducing downtime during expected failures or maintenance, while disaster recovery focuses on restoring service after a major outage or catastrophic failure. Disaster recovery eliminates the need to test backups or failover procedures. Disaster recovery plans should be tested. Backups and failover procedures must be validated before an actual outage. High availability requires all resources to be deployed in only one data center. Deploying in only one data center can create a single point of failure. High availability usually uses redundancy across fault domains, zones, or regions. High availability and disaster recovery both mean that resources must never scale down. Scaling behavior is separate from high availability and disaster recovery. Auto-scaling down does not automatically conflict with either concept. The exam clue is, high availability keeps services accessible through component failures, while disaster recovery restores after major outages. Question 45. A company stores data across Azure, Microsoft 365, and several other data sources. The compliance team wants to discover, classify, and manage sensitive data across the organization. They also want a catalog that helps users understand what data exists and where it is located. A. Azure Monitor. B. Microsoft Purview. C. Microsoft Defender for Cloud. D. Azure Advisor. The correct answer is B. Microsoft Purview. Microsoft Purview helps organizations discover, classify, govern, and manage data across Azure, Microsoft 365, and other data sources. Azure Monitor. Azure Monitor collects metrics and logs for resource health and performance. It does not provide enterprise data discovery, classification, and catalog capabilities. Microsoft Defender. For cloud, Defender for Cloud helps improve cloud security posture and provides security recommendations. It is not the main data governance catalog and classification service. Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor provides recommendations for cost, reliability, security, performance, and operational excellence. It does not catalog or classify organizational data. The exam clue is discover, classify, catalog, and govern sensitive data across Microsoft Cloud and other sources. Question 46. A company is building an application that must react when files are uploaded to Azure Blob storage. When a blob is created, the application should receive an event and trigger downstream processing. The company does not need to ingest millions of telemetry events per second. A. Azure Event Hubs. B. Azure Queue Storage. C. Azure Event Grid. D. Azure Service Bus. The correct answer is C. Azure Event Grid. Event Grid routes events from Azure services and custom sources to event handlers. Blob storage can publish events such as blob creation to Event Grid. Azure Event Hubs. Event Hubs is designed for high-throughput event streaming and telemetry ingestion. The scenario is about reacting to discrete resource events such as blob creation. Azure Queue Storage. Queue storage can decouple application components with simple queues, but Event Grid is the native event routing service for Azure resource events like blob-created notifications. Azure Service Bus. Service Bus is for enterprise messaging with queues and topics. It is not the primary Azure resource event routing service. The exam clue is react to individual Azure service events such as new blob creation, not high-volume telemetry streaming. Question 47. A company has servers running in its on-premises data center and in another public cloud. The operations team wants to manage these servers from Azure by applying Azure governance and monitoring tools to them, even though the servers are not running in Azure. A. Azure Arc. B. Azure Bastion. C. Azure Site Recovery. D. Azure Resource Manager Templates. The correct answer is A. Azure Arc. Azure Arc extends Azure management, governance, and monitoring capabilities to resources outside Azure, including on-premises servers and servers in other clouds. Azure Bastion. Azure Bastion provides secure RDP to SSH access to Azure virtual machines without exposing public ports. It does not extend Azure governance to non-Azure servers. Azure Site Recovery. Site recovery helps with disaster recovery and replication/failover of workloads. It is not the main service for managing hybrid and multi-cloud resources through Azure. Azure Resource Manager Templates. ARM templates define Azure infrastructure as code. They do not onboard non-Azure servers for Azure governance and monitoring. The exam clue is extend Azure management and governance to servers outside Azure. Question 48. A company is choosing Azure Storage Services for two application requirements. 1. Store unstructured files such as images, videos, and backups. 2. Store messages that application components can retrieve and process asynchronously. A. Azure Disk Storage. B. Azure Blob Storage. C. Azure Files. D. Azure Queue Storage. E. Azure Table Storage. The correct answers are B and D. Azure Blob Storage and Azure Queue Storage. Blob storage is designed for unstructured object data, and Queue storage stores messages for asynchronous application processing. Azure Disk Storage. Disk storage provides block storage for Azure virtual machines. It is not the best match for general unstructured object storage or application message queues. Azure Files. Azure Files provides managed SMB NFS file shares. It can store files, but the question's unstructured object storage requirement is a better fit for blob storage. Azure Table Storage. Table storage is a NoSQL key value store. It does not provide object storage for media or backups or queue-based messaging. The exam clue is use blob storage for unstructured objects and queue storage for asynchronous messages. Question 49. A company is planning to migrate several on-premises workloads to Azure. Before migrating, the finance team wants to estimate the cost difference between running the workloads in the current data center and running equivalent workloads in Azure. A. Azure Pricing Calculator. B. Microsoft Cost Management. C. Total Cost of Ownership Calculator. D. Azure Advisor. The correct answer is C. Total Cost of Ownership Calculator. The TCO calculator is designed to estimate cost savings by comparing current on-premises infrastructure costs with equivalent Azure workloads. Azure Pricing Calculator. The Azure Pricing Calculator estimates the cost of selected Azure services. It is useful for pricing an Azure solution, but it does not focus on comparing current on-premises data center costs against Azure migration costs. Microsoft Cost Management. Cost management analyzes and monitors Azure spending after resources are running. It is not the main pre-migration comparison tool for on-premises versus Azure costs. Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor provides recommendations for existing Azure resources, including cost optimizations. It is not the primary tool for pre-migration TCO comparison. The exam clue is compare current on-premises infrastructure costs with equivalent Azure workload costs before migration. Question 50. A company uses Azure role-based access control to manage access to Azure resources. An administrator assigns a user the reader role at the resource group scope. A. The user can view resources in that resource group. B. The user can modify all resources in that resource group. C. The user automatically receives reader access to resources in other resource groups in the same subscription. D. The user can view resources contained in the resource group unless a more specific deny assignment or restriction applies. E. The user becomes an owner of the subscription that contains the resource group. The correct answers are A and D. The user can view resources in that resource group, and the user can view resources contained in the resource group unless a more specific deny assignment or restriction applies. The reader role allows viewing resources at the assigned resource group scope and inherits to resources inside that resource group, subject to more specific restrictions such as deny assignments. The user can modify all resources in that resource group. Modifying resources requires broader permissions, such as contributor or owner, not reader. The user automatically receives reader access to resources in other resource groups in the same subscription. RBAC assignments apply at the assigned scope and inherit downward. A resource group assignment applies to resources inside that resource group, not to sibling resource groups. The user becomes an owner of the subscription that contains the resource group. Assigning reader at a resource group scope does not grant ownership of the subscription. The exam clue is RBAC permissions inherit from the assigned scope down to contained resources, but not sideways to other scopes. You made it through all 50 questions. Do not treat missed answers as failure. Treat them as your study map. Look for patterns, cloud concepts, identity, networking, pricing, security, or governance. Replay the questions you missed, focus on the exam trap, and ask why the wrong choices were tempting. That is how practice turns into real exam confidence. Thanks for studying with WebLizard Cert Lab. If this practice exam helped, save it so you can come back to the questions you missed. For deeper review, continue with the AZ-900 course videos and more practice questions on the channel. No dumps, no fluff, just source-backed practice to help you build real Azure fundamentals confidence.